My sister sold my mountain cabin for $890,000 until the title insurance team discovered. The trust records the smell of roasted turkey filled my mother's dining room, but my mouth felt numb and useless, as if taste itself had stepped away from me. My sister Lauren stood at the head of the table with a champagne glass lifted high, smiling wide while announcing the sale of my mountain cabin as if she had just won something she deserved. Our parents glowed with pride. Her husband filmed the moment on his phone. One of the kids joked about what new gaming system Aunt Lauren would buy now, and she kept talking, scrolling on her screen, saying the buyers came from California, tech money, no negotiations, full asking price, $890,000 in cash. She turned the phone so everyone could see the contract. Signed and complete. I slowly set my fork down, ceramic tapping softly against my mother's good china, and said, in an even voice, "That cabin belongs to me." Lauren did not flinch. She smiled tighter and said it was Dad's cabin, and he left it to both of us. I told her he placed it in a trust for me. She replied that the trust no longer existed, explaining it the way someone speaks to a confused child, saying Mom dissolved it after Dad passed and that Mom had already told me. I looked at my mother, who was slicing turkey into neat little pieces without looking up, and in that moment I felt the old familiar lie I used to tell myself crumble again. The idea that if I stayed calm long enough someone would eventually choose honesty over comfort. I said quietly that the trust was irrevocable. Lauren laughed, bright and dismissive, reminding everyone of another time she claimed I was confused, saying this was just like when I thought I owned the lake house. And around the table 15 faces watched me become the problem. Dramatic and difficult and awkward. I had imagined this moment for 2 years, planned arguments and explanations, but all I did was sit still and wait for the systems I had already set in motion to speak for me. Lauren went on about closing dates and kitchen remodels, granite countertops and contractors starting Monday. She passed her phone around with stone samples, and while everyone leaned in, my phone vibrated with a message from Karen Mitchell, the title insurance underwriter who helped my father establish the trust years earlier. She said she had reviewed the file and was calling now and asked if I was ready. 2 minutes later, Lauren's phone rang. She answered confidently. Then her face shifted through confusion into irritation, and finally something hollow and pale. She argued that it was impossible and that her lawyer reviewed everything. Then she went quiet and ended the call. The room stilled. Even the kids stopped. Someone asked if there was a problem. Lauren said the title company claimed there was an issue with the deed. My mother's fork froze. Lauren swallowed and said they claimed the cabin was in a trust. An irrevocable trust in my name. She looked at me, calculating already. I answered my ringing phone and put it on speaker. Steady and calm. Karen introduced herself clearly and said she was calling about the property on Clearwater Ridge. She explained that they had halted a fraudulent transaction involving my mountain cabin and that my sister had attempted to sell property held in my irrevocable trust created by my late father in 2019. She said the sale could not proceed and that they had notified the buyers and broker and would be filing a fraud report. The silence was absolute. I asked Karen to explain what irrevocable meant, and she stated plainly that such a trust could not be altered without my permission, that my father, Daniel Parker, established it specifically for me, that the documents were notarized and recorded, and that my sister had no authority to sell the property. Lauren stood up abruptly, insisting this was insane, but Karen cut in, saying she had my father's signature witnessed and recorded and that the document clearly stated the cabin was for me alone. I asked her to email the trust to everyone present. And seconds later, phones buzzed as faces changed while they read. My uncle stared at Lauren, asking if she knew. Lauren snapped that she thought it was dissolved. And my mother quietly admitted she never said that and that Lauren assumed she would not correct her. The room fractured into overlapping arguments, and I stepped outside into the cold Colorado air, sitting on the steps my father built years ago and finally letting myself feel everything. I remembered sitting beside him in a lawyer's office in March 2019 after his terminal diagnosis, the smell of old books and polish, Karen and attorney Stephen Brooks across from us, my father telling me my mother would need the city house and Lauren would receive the life insurance, but the cabin would be mine. I asked why, and he told me because I showed up. Every chemo appointment, every bad day, quietly and without display. He said he would tell the family himself, but the cancer moved faster than his plans. And after the funeral, I found his letter tucked into the trust papers saying they would claim he forgot or changed his mind and that I should not believe them. Sitting on those cold steps, I thought about the silent ledger I had been keeping since he died. Not money but costs. Hope spent when my mother skipped appointments. Trust lost when Lauren promised visits that never happened. Belief in fairness erased when assets were divided before I arrived. Years of being labeled confused when I was simply alone, and now the sympathy I once held for Lauren's money problems gone after learning she spent funds from a theft that never cleared. The ledger was not about revenge, but clarity. Accepting that some systems exist to drain you and survival means stepping out of them. The door opened, and my Uncle Mark joined me, saying he never knew about the trust and that Lauren was unraveling inside, as buyers and contractors demanded answers. He told me my father had spoken to him shortly before dying, worried I would be punished for being the one who stayed, and that now he understood that the trust was protection, not from strangers but from family. He gave me his lawyer's number and insisted on paying. The next morning, I sat in a Denver office with attorney Brian Lewis and my uncle, laying out every document and message. Brian reviewed everything silently before calling it textbook fraud, explaining that Lauren knowingly forged ownership documents, a felony, and from there, the process began to move with cold precision. Evidence preserved, listings pulled, buyers notified, messages archived, fraud reports filed, money traced, lawsuits stacked, liens placed, licenses suspended, investigations opened, accounts frozen, and through it all the systems did exactly what they were designed to do. Justice not loud or emotional but methodical and crushing. Christmas passed without me at the family table, calls unanswered, settlement offers ignored, and instead, I drove to the cabin with my rescue dog Scout, spending quiet days in snow and smoke and silence, thinking about my father's words and how showing up once felt ordinary until I learned how rare it truly was. Christmas morning arrived without ceremony and without noise, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than arguments ever could. My phone stayed dark on the nightstand and I let it, choosing not to look for messages that would only ask me to soften something I did not break. The cabin sat wrapped in snow and pine scent. Scout padded across the floor and pressed against my leg like he understood that stillness was the point. I brewed coffee and watched steam rise while thinking about how quickly my family moved from celebration to collapse. How confidence evaporates when truth walks into the room uninvited. I stayed there through the holiday, hiking familiar trails my father once cleared himself, remembering how he worked without witnesses and built things meant to last. And by the time I drove back down the mountain, I felt steadier than I had in years. Not relieved exactly, but aligned. As if my feet were finally under me again instead of bracing for someone else to shove me sideways. Legal process did not pause for holidays or feelings, and I learned quickly how momentum works once it starts. Brian Lewis called every few days with updates delivered in the same calm voice, regardless of how serious the content was. Buyers from California had filed their lawsuit formally and were demanding reimbursement for every dollar spent plus damages for misrepresentation. The contractor who ordered stone and fixtures filed his lien when Lauren failed to return his deposit. The real estate brokerage opened an internal investigation and immediately distanced itself from her. Karen Mitchell sent documentation confirming the title freeze and the fraud reports submitted to county and state offices. Every call reinforced the same reality that this was no longer a family disagreement but a documented attempt to take something that never belonged to her. And once the system recognized that fact, it moved without hesitation or mercy. Lauren tried to contact me during that time, first with texts that sounded confused and wounded, then with longer messages that shifted into anger and accusation. She claimed she had been misled and that lawyers had reassured her. She said our mother told her the trust was gone and that I was being dramatic by escalating it. When I did not respond, the tone sharpened and she warned that dragging this out would destroy relationships forever. I forwarded everything to Brian without comment. He advised me not to engage and explained that communication now only created openings for manipulation. It felt strange to ignore someone I once shared a childhood with, but it also felt clean. Like closing a door that had been left swinging for too long. Our mother sent a letter instead of calling, handwritten and careful, asking me to remember that family makes mistakes and that public consequences were unnecessary. She said Lauren was under stress and that grief does strange things to people. She suggested mediation and forgiveness and used language that placed responsibility for peace squarely on my shoulders. I read the letter once and folded it back into the envelope. I did not feel angry reading it, just tired. Tired of being asked to absorb damage quietly so others could remain comfortable. Tired of explanations that erased intent and excused harm. I did not reply. And in that silence, something inside me settled into place. With unexpected calm by mid-January, the criminal investigation became real in a way that could not be brushed aside. A district attorney assigned an investigator and scheduled an interview with Lauren. Brian explained potential outcomes in plain language, including probation or prison time. fines, restitution, a permanent record. He emphasized that none of this was driven by my feelings but by evidence and statute. The forged affidavit she submitted claimed sole ownership of the cabin and carried a notarized signature that did not belong to her. That single document anchored everything that followed, and once exposed, it collapsed every defense she attempted to build. I learned that lies can survive socially for years, but they do not survive. Paperwork. Uncle Mark remained a steady presence through those weeks, calling to check on me and occasionally sharing updates I did not ask for but appreciated. He told me Lauren blamed everyone but herself and shifted stories depending on the listener. He said our mother cried often and insisted she never meant for things to go this far. He also told me he had declined when Lauren asked him for money, explaining gently that consequences were part of learning and that rescuing her now would only delay what needed to happen. Hearing that felt grounding, like confirmation that at least one adult in my family understood the difference between compassion and innate. Brought depositions and affidavits, and stacks of documents that reduced months of chaos into timelines and bulletproof facts. I spent hours with Brian reviewing emails and texts and social posts where Lauren referred to the cabin as hers long before listing it, messages where she dismissed my objections and told me to let it go. Each piece built a picture of intent that no amount of denial could erase. The buyer's attorney pushed aggressively, and the broker moved quickly to limit liability. Lauren changed lawyers twice during that period, and each switch seemed to strip away another layer of confidence. She stopped contacting me altogether once her accounts were frozen by court order and her options narrowed to compliance or collapse. When spring arrived, the mountain roads cleared and I returned to the cabin more frequently, bringing tools and paint and a quiet sense of ownership that felt earned rather than claimed. I replaced worn flooring and updated wiring my father never got around to. Scout followed me room to room and slept in sun patches like he had lived there his whole life. Neighbors stopped by occasionally and asked how things were going, and I answered honestly but briefly, saying it had been a difficult year but that the cabin was finally at rest. Working with my hands helped process what my mind could not. Each repaired hinge and cleaned window felt like reclaiming something beyond property, like repairing a boundary that had been ignored for too long. The criminal case resolved faster than I expected. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Lauren accepted a plea agreement in March. No contest to fraud charges, probation, community service, restitution to buyers and contractor, fines, and a permanent record that would follow her wherever she went. Brian explained that while prison was possible, judges often favored restitution and monitoring for first offenses. I felt no disappointment hearing that outcome, only closure. The point was never punishment but correction. The system recognized the harm and required repair. That was enough. The civil case followed in April and ended in settlement. Lauren agreed to pay damages and my legal fees. The money came from selling her house after refinancing failed under the account freeze. She and her husband moved into an apartment across town, and her lifestyle contracted overnight. Uncle Mark said she was furious and humiliated and blamed me entirely. I did not ask for details. Her feelings were no longer my responsibility in learning. That felt like a milestone I had waited years to reach. By early summer, the Real Estate Commission concluded its investigation and suspended the broker's license pending long-term review. Multiple complaints surfaced once my case became public and the profession closed ranks quickly. Watching careers unwind was sobering but instructive. Accountability ripples outward, and systems either correct or corrode, depending on whether they are allowed to function. My father understood that when he built protections stronger than sentiment. And standing in the cabin one evening, as light faded across the ridge, I finally understood it too. Summer settled over the mountains with long quiet days and cool nights. The kind that invite reflection whether you want it or not. I spent most mornings on the deck with coffee, watching light move across the ridge and thinking about how quickly certainty can be rebuilt once chaos stops intruding. The legal noise had faded to background murmurs by then, and what remained was space. Space to decide what came next without anyone else leaning over my shoulder, insisting on their version of events. Scout chased birds and slept in the shade and seemed perfectly content with the slower rhythm. I received the first restitution notice in early June, a formal letter outlining payment schedules and compliance terms. It was oddly anticlimactic to see the damage reduced to columns and dates. Brian explained that this phase was mostly administrative and that my involvement would be minimal unless Lauren failed to comply. He sounded confident she would not test the court again. People who lose everything rarely gamble with what little remains. I filed the letter away and felt a strange mix of finality and distance, as if the storm had passed and left behind debris I no longer needed to examine. Uncle Mark Visited one weekend with fishing gear and sandwiches. We spent hours along Clearwater Creek, casting lines and talking about nothing urgent. He told me stories about my father that I had never heard, small moments that revealed who he was when no one was watching, the patience he had with tools and animals, the way he planned for worst cases without broadcasting it as pessimism. Hearing those stories filled in gaps I did not know were there and helped me understand the trust not as a last-minute decision but as part of a larger pattern of care. My father built redundancy into love because he knew people fail. Our mother did not contact me that summer, but I heard through relatives that she struggled with the fallout. Friendships strained under gossip and assumptions. And she did not enjoy being associated with a scandal she believed should have stayed private. The narrative she preferred placed her as a grieving widow caught between daughters, not as someone who enabled deception by omission. I felt no urge to correct that story or confront her version. Distance does not require agreement, it requires acceptance of limits. And my limit had been reached. Lauren attempted one more indirect communication through a mutual cousin, a message framed as regret but heavy with grievance. She claimed the consequences were disproportionate and that I could have stopped it at any point by choosing family over process. The cousin asked if I wanted to respond and I said no, explaining that choosing process was the point. Systems exist so that outcomes do not depend on who cries hardest or shouts longest. Declining to engage was not cruelty but consistency, and consistency was something my life had lacked before the trust surfaced. I poured energy into the cabin that season, updating the kitchen my father built decades earlier without erasing its character. Solar panels went in quietly and efficiently. The master bedroom was repainted in warm neutral tones. Each improvement felt like stewardship rather than conquest. Neighbors stopped by to compliment the changes and share local news. Some had heard fragments of the story and expressed sympathy. Others knew nothing and treated me as simply another resident investing in the community. I preferred the latter interactions. Anonymity can be a gift. Karen Mitchell visited for lunch one afternoon, bringing a bottle of wine and an easy laugh. She talked about her work and other cases where documentation saved people from ruin. She said mine stood out because everything had been preserved so carefully by my father years before it was needed. We talked about her daughter preparing for college and my tentative idea of offering the cabin as a writer's retreat part-time. The conversation felt normal and future-focused, a reminder that not every relationship is transactional or fraught. Some exist simply because people choose competence and kindness. As July progressed, the final pieces of the civil settlement locked into place, funds transferred and liens released. Brian called to confirm closure and congratulated me on seeing it through without losing myself to bitterness. He said many clients spiral during long disputes and confuse justice with vindication. Maintaining boundaries had protected me as much as any clause in the trust. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time, letting that sink in, realizing how much effort it takes to remain steady when chaos invites reaction. I reflected often on the ghost ledger I once kept mentally, the list of costs accumulated through years of quiet concessions. Something shifted as summer wore on, and that ledger lost its hold. Entries that once felt raw softened into lessons rather than wounds. Understanding replaced resentment, not because harm disappeared but because it no longer dictated my decisions. Clarity can be merciful when it frees you from repeating patterns you did not choose consciously. One evening, Uncle Mark mentioned that Lauren was considering leaving town. The apartment felt temporary, and her reputation lingered wherever she went. He said she talked about starting over somewhere no one knew her name. I wished her no ill and felt no pull to intervene. Starting over is meaningful only when accountability comes with you. Without it, relocation is just another attempt to outrun consequences. Hearing this confirmed my decision to remain silent and anchored where I was. August brought visitors to the cabin, friends who needed space and found comfort in the mountains. They asked gentle questions and respected the boundaries I set around details. We cooked meals together and shared long conversations by the fire pit. Laughter returned to the property without tension attached. Watching others relax, there affirmed my instinct to share the space selectively rather than hoard it defensively. Protection does not require isolation. It requires discernment. As the first hints of fall appeared, I took inventory of what had changed internally. Fear no longer shaped my responses. Obligation loosened its grip. I understood that family ties do not override personal safety or integrity. My father did not create distance out of spite, but out of foresight. Honoring that choice meant trusting his judgment even when it contradicted cultural expectations about forgiveness and unity. The season closed with a sense of completion I had not expected to feel so soon. The legal chapters ended cleanly and the emotional ones settled into something quieter and more durable. standing on the deck one night, watching stars emerge over the ridge. I felt grounded in a way that had nothing to do with winning or losing. It came from alignment between truth and action, between what was built and what was protected. And for the first time since my father died, that alignment felt like home. Autumn arrived with a slower, quieter energy that matched the pace of my thoughts. The trees around the cabin shifted into deep gold and rust, and the air carried that sharp, clean edge that makes everything feel honest. I spent mornings working at the long table by the window, writing and planning, and sometimes doing nothing at all. Scouts settled into a routine of patrols and naps as if he had always belonged there. The silence no longer felt like recovery but like a baseline. Something steady I could trust. The absence of contact from my family continued without effort on my part. No calls slipped through and no letters appeared unexpectedly. It became clear that silence can be mutual even when only one side chooses it intentionally. Friends asked gently whether that absence hurt, and I found that the answer changed over time. Early on it felt like relief, dressed as numbness. Later, it felt like clarity. Relationships that require constant self-erasure to survive are not relationships worth maintaining. Uncle Mark remained my single thread back to that world, and even that connection evolved. Our conversations shifted away from updates and explanations into shared interests and plans. He talked about retirement and travel and learning new skills he put off for years. Watching him choose a different rhythm for his own life reminded me that reinvention is not only for people forced into corners. Sometimes it is simply the reward for recognizing that time is finite. In October, the final restitution payment cleared and Brian called one last time to close my file officially. He wished me well and said that in his line of work, clean endings were rare. Most cases lingered emotionally even after paperwork ended. When the call ended, I felt an unexpected gratitude, not just for his expertise, but for the reminder that resolution is something you notice only when it arrives quietly. There was no celebration or dramatic release, just the sense that a door had closed and stayed closed. I began offering the cabin to a small circle of writers and artists that fall, people who needed uninterrupted space and understood respect for place. The first guest stayed a week and left behind a note thanking me for the stillness and the light. Sharing the cabin this way felt aligned with what my father built it for, not ownership for its own sake, but refuge. I set clear boundaries and kept the calendar light. Stewardship again, rather than exploitation. Karen Mitchell visited once more before winter set in, bringing soup and stories and an ease that comes from shared understanding. We talked about how often fraud hides behind assumptions of trust and how systems only work when someone insists on using them fully. She said many people abandon process halfway through because social pressure feels heavier than legal obligation. Hearing that reinforced how close I came to doing the same before the truth intervened at that table. The difference between collapse and stability sometimes comes down to a single refusal to back down. As the days shortened, I spent more time inside by the fire reading my father's letter framed on the wall. The words no longer stung or burned with vindication. They read like instructions, calmly delivered by someone who understood the terrain better than I did at the time. He anticipated resistance and disbelief not because he was cynical, but because he was observant. Loving someone does not require blindness. Sometimes it requires preparation. I thought often about Lauren during those months without indulging in speculation or judgment. Knowing the facts was enough. Her life had narrowed dramatically and rebuilding would be slow and humbling. I hoped she learned something lasting from it, though I understood that hope was optional, not necessary. Growth belongs to the person facing consequence, not to the one who stepped aside. Releasing responsibility for her outcome was one of the quietest yet most significant shifts I experienced. The first snow fell early in November, dusting the ground lightly and reminding me of that Thanksgiving a year earlier when everything fractured in plain sight. The memory surfaced without the spike of adrenaline it once carried. Instead, it felt like a reference point, marking distance traveled. I could see the scene clearly now, without inserting myself emotionally back into it. Perspective does not erase memory, but it changes its temperature. Friends gathered at the cabin for a small meal before winter closed the roads. Laughter filled the space easily, and without edge. Watching people move comfortably through rooms that once held so much tension felt like a reclamation deeper than legal ownership. Energy lingers where conflict lives and dissolves only when something healthier replaces it. That night, as the fire burned low, I realized the cabin no longer carried the weight of being defended. It simply existed. My mother sent another letter in late November, shorter than the first and more restrained. She spoke of time and distance, and the hope that someday things could be different. She did not apologize or acknowledge specifics. The letter read like an opening rather than a bridge. I held it for several days before filing it away without response. Forgiveness without accountability is an invitation to repetition, and I had learned to recognize invitations that cost too much. Winter deepened, and routines solidified. Mornings of writing and afternoons of walking trails with Scout, evenings of quiet meals and early nights. The simplicity was not accidental but chosen deliberately after years of emotional noise. I understood now how easily life fills with obligations disguised as loyalty. Choosing peace requires active maintenance, just like any other structure worth preserving. As the year turned, I took inventory, not of losses, but of alignments. My actions matched my values without negotiation. Boundaries held without constant reinforcement. The systems my father trusted proved themselves under pressure, and then receded into the background where good systems belong. Nothing demanded my vigilance anymore, because everything functioned as designed. Standing on the deck one evening watching snow fall thick and slow, I felt a calm confidence that had nothing to do with triumph. It came from knowing that what I had protected remained intact, and what I had released no longer pulled at me. The cabin stood solid against the cold, not because it was defended but because it was built correctly from the start. In that realization, I found a quiet pride, not in winning but in enduring without compromise. January returned quietly without ceremony. A full year having passed since that Thanksgiving when everything cracked open in front of witnesses. I woke early most mornings to snow layered thick on the pines and the sound of the fire settling overnight. Scout slept near the hearth and barely stirred when I moved. The cabin felt lived in now, not defended or guarded but settled, like a place that understood. It was sci-fi wrote most days that winter, not about the legal battle or my family but about stillness and landscapes and the way silence changes once it stops being forced on you. The idea of turning the cabin into a seasonal retreat took shape slowly and intentionally. I wanted it to remain a place of grounding rather than productivity pressure. People who came needed space, not instruction. The applications I accepted reflected that, thoughtful and respectful. And each guest treated the cabin with care, as if sensing it carried a story that did not need to be spoken aloud. Visited again in February bringing bread she baked herself, and news about her daughter being accepted into college. We celebrated with simple food and long conversation. She said cases like mine often stayed with her because they demonstrated why meticulous work mattered years before anyone noticed. She called my father wise and methodical and said he trusted systems, not because he lacked faith in people but because he understood human nature. Hearing someone outside the family name his choices with respect reinforced something steady inside Mark continued his monthly visits, and by spring we had settled into a rhythm of fishing lessons and shared meals. He never pushed reconciliation or advice. His support came without agenda. One afternoon while walking the creek, he said quietly that my father would be proud, not of the outcome but of how I carried myself through it. The comment landed deeper than any praise I had received before. Pride that acknowledged restraint rather than dominance felt earned in a way. Loud approval. Never had he heard indirectly that Lauren struggled to find stable work and moved again. The details blurred as they reached me and I did not try to clarify them. Knowing less felt healthier than knowing everything. Curiosity no longer served me. Detachment did. I wished her the understanding that consequences teach but did not feel obligated to monitor her progress. Closure does not require updates. In April, I finished the last major update on the cabin. A small reading nook by the west window where light softened in the evenings. I placed my father's framed letter nearby, not as a warning or trophy but as context. Visitors sometimes asked about it, and I answered simply that it was from my father and that it mattered. Explanations beyond that were unnecessary. Meaning does not require full disclosure. The silence between my mother and me remained consistent and unbroken. Not hostile or dramatic, but simply absent, like a road no longer traveled. I noticed how little space that absence occupied in my daily life now compared to how heavy it once felt. Grief changes shape when you stop feeding it explanations. Acceptance can coexist with sadness without demanding action. One afternoon, in early summer, I sat on the deck watching Scout doze and realized that guilt had not returned even when life stabilized. I had expected it might, waiting quietly for me to relax so it could resurface, but it never did. Guilt requires wrongdoing, and I had none to account for. Protecting what was legally and morally mine was not cruelty, it was stewardship. The distinction felt permanent. People sometimes asked whether I would ever speak to my family again, and I answered honestly that I did not know and did not need to know. Certainty is not required for peace. Boundaries can exist without predictions. The future does not demand promises, it only reflects patterns. And the patterns I trusted now were the ones I chose deliberately by. Late summer, the cabin calendar filled steadily with respectful guests and long empty stretches reserved just for me. Balance mattered. Ownership without enjoyment is just another form of burden. Each season added texture rather than tension. The land responded to care with quiet reliability. Something my father always believed in more than sentiment in. The anniversary of that Thanksgiving, I cooked a simple meal alone. Turkey, not out of nostalgia, but because it felt neutral again. I ate by the window and watched snow fall lightly. The memory surfaced but did not overwhelm. It existed as a marker, not a wound. I could see the entire arc clearly now, from preparation to collision to resolution. Understanding replaced rumination that night. I read my father's letter once more, and noticed a line that had faded into the background before. He wrote that systems are built not because we distrust love, but because love deserves protection from those who misuse it. The words settled differently now. Less like justification, and more like inheritance. The cabin stood solid against the cold exactly as he built it. Quiet and contained, and protected not by secrecy or force but by foresight. My name alone rested on the title, free and clear. The peace inside it was not accidental but chosen and maintained. And as I watched the fire burn low and Scout stretch in his sleep, I understood that my future was not defined by what was taken or attempted but by what remained intact. The silence was mine. The land was mine. The life unfolding there was mine. Not because I fought for it loudly, but because one person cared enough to build something strong enough to hold when tested. And I cared enough to trust it when the moment came.